I now welcome the representative of the Australian Defence Association. For the record, would you please state your full name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
My name is Neil Frederick James and I appear today as the Federal Executive Director of the Australia Defence Association.
Although the committee does not require you to give evidence on oath, I remind witnesses that this hearing is a legal proceeding of Parliament and warrants the same respect as proceedings of the House itself. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard. Do you wish to make some introductory remarks before we proceed to questions?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. As well as being the Federal Executive Director of the Association, my personal background includes over 2 decades as an ADF officer in intelligence, counterintelligence and security intelligence appointments, both here and overseas, including extensive interaction with 5 of our 6 intelligence and security agencies or their predecessors. I mention that just to assist with any general questions you may have. In June this year, the Australia Defence Association celebrated its 40th anniversary as Australia's only truly independent, staunchly non-partisan, national public interest watchdog organisation for strategic security, defence and wider national security issues. Our public interest guardianship role and responsibilities remain focused on the capacity, operations and accountability of the Australian Defence Force, Australia's 6 intelligence and security agencies, and the counter-terrorism role of the Australian Federal Police and other federal and state law enforcement agencies. Over the 4 decades since 1975, the ADA has often been invited to testify to parliamentary committee and official inquiries, but especially to those undertaken by the Defence Subcommittee of the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, and the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and indeed its predecessors. As probably most of you are no doubt aware, the ADA has always been a strong supporter of Parliament's machinery of government oversight committees. We thank the committee for their latest invitation regarding your inquiry into the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Bill No. 1, 2015. With the recent assumption of her appointment as Minister for Defence, we also note the ADA first worked extensively with Senator Marise Payne when she chaired the Senate Legal and Constitutional Legislation Committee inquiry into the second tranche of counter-terrorism legislation back in 2005. We raise this only to note our long-standing public interest monitoring record regarding such legislation and its execution by the Australian Federal Police, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation and our state and territory police services. Indeed, as with much of our work with both strategic security and domestic security issues, ADA research and public monitoring often runs well ahead of wider community awareness of such matters by several years in some cases and often around 6 to 18 months. My personal experience, I've lived and worked in half a dozen Muslim majority countries in Southeast Asia, South Asia and the Middle East, and I believe personally I have a reasonable understanding of Islamic theology and practice. As background, we consider that our 4-decade record clearly demonstrates the ADA can offer views on strategic and domestic security issues that benefit from 3 factors in particular. First, due to the nature of the issues involved, our contributions necessarily involve a much longer-term perspective regarding both past history and potential future challenges than most other participants in informed public debate, and indeed in uninformed public debate. Second, in terms of Australia's domestic security risks, we've long been an organisation focused on Australia achieving and maintaining an effective balance between community security and individual liberty imperatives at any one time. This particular perspective and role concerning weighing the necessary balance does not seem to be shared by any other civil liberties organisation in the country. Third, our long-standing and well-proven non-partisan stance generally is widely accepted by both governing political parties and by the alternative government parties at any one time. In regard to the Counter-Terrorism Legislation Amendment Bill No. 1, 2015 in general, the ADF is satisfied with the intent, thrust and detail of the bill. The only significant aspect of the bill is the amendment extending the use of control orders to persons aged up 14 rather than the existing 16. Given recent terrorist acts in Australia and the numerous additional safeguards applied in the bill to persons aged 14 to 17, the ADA considers this extension is fully justified, but only as long as control orders are required as a counter-terrorism measure. Given the rest of the amendments in the bill are really technical in nature and relate to refining practices widely regarded as uncontroversial rather than serious matters of principle, the ADA considers no aspect of this bill requires a sunset clause. In contributing to your overall inquiry into this bill, the ADA also seeks to raise 4 general points about the overall situation and the community atmospherics concerning the bill and its eventual execution as law. First, having commented on each tranche of counter-terrorism and associated legislation over the last decade or so, the ADA considers it's well worth noting that concerns aroused in various parts of the Australian community by each tranche have largely not been borne out by the eventual operation of such laws in practice. This national record is encouraging in terms of applying the laws, in demonstrating that the circumstances in which this is necessary are actually few and far between, as much evidence is pointed out this morning, and in testifying to the overall maturity, resilience and tolerance of the wider Australian community. Given the largely technical nature of the amendment set out in this bill, it seems that the degree of concern about it is both more limited and less emotive than with previous counter-terrorist legislation. Certainly the amount of scaremongering and the levels of emotive protest from partisan and single-issue quarters are much less with this particular bill. Our second general point is that the only incident since 2001 where the application of previous counter-terrorism laws has actually resulted in a significant transgression of individual civil liberties was the detention and unnecessary deportation of Dr. Mohammed Hanif in 2007. Moreover, even in this case, overzealous concern about civil liberties ironically ended up working against the intention and operation of the counter-terrorism laws concerned, and indeed against the protections afforded to Dr. Hanif. Based on the experience of other Western jurisdictions with much longer authorised detention periods, it's probable that Dr. Hanif would have been released quicker and cleared more swiftly if the complex police investigation had not had to be so hurried and consequently bungled, because he could only be detained for such a short period before he could be subsequently questioned and charges preferred. We note that a decision at the recent Council of Australian Governments is intended to address this particular issue, chiefly by extending permissible detention periods and allowing some questioning of the person involved during such detention. Our third general point is that there continues to be much ill-informed public discussion on all sides about the perceived and real effects of counter-terrorism laws and their enforcement among some Australians of the Islamic faith. Since 2001, the ADA has always drawn the necessary distinction between the nature of Islamist terrorism as an extremist political religious movement involving only a minority of Muslims and the Islamic faith itself as practised by most Muslims. In this regard, we have long pointed out that sloppy terminology such as Islamic or jihadi terrorism is both inaccurate and counterproductive, not least because it helps Islamists propagate the propaganda myth that the laws intended to counter only Islamist and other terrorism are somehow aimed instead at all Muslims and the Islamic faith itself. Such sloppy terminology and thinking not only aids Islamist recruitment, it also undermines both the Islamic community cooperation the police and ASIO needed to fight terrorism directly and counter-radicalisation measures within that community to fight terrorism indirectly and sustainably by highlighting the religious and theological bigotry inherent in Islamism. It's also worth noting at this juncture that other forms of inaccurate terminology are also very counterproductive in the fight against terrorism. For example, constant incorrect media and other reference to ASIO as a spy agency rather than a security intelligence one, and to its staff as spies rather than as intelligence officers, also assist Islamist propaganda, unnecessarily confuses law-abiding citizens of all faiths, and unnecessarily hampers Islamic and wider community cooperation with ASIO. The ADA respectfully suggests that the PJCIS should hammer this message home in every one of your reports. Our fourth and final general point concerns the problem caused by the high degree of persistent denial in parts of Australia's Islamic community that rejects any reference to or consideration of the purported theological basis of the Islamist message, no matter how bigoted or simplistic such theological interpretations may be in their misrepresentation. This persistent denial pervading Australia's Islamic community must be acknowledged in order to be eradicated, and we perhaps saw an example of this morning. If it is not confronted and eradicated within the Islamic community by that community, then the bigotry and other extreme beliefs sustaining their Islamist minority can never be effectively countered. This desire is often manifested by knee-jerk and scattergun false allegations of supposed Islamophobia by some of Australia's Islamic leaders and other Australians. It is clearly not somehow Islamophobic to highlight, for example, the high degree of Islamic community denial about Islamist terrorism, nor is it somehow phobic for any informed Australian to make legitimate and reasonable comment about the Islamic faith, or indeed any other faith generally. Having publicly discussed the necessary differences between Islamism and Islam for well over a decade, and generally well ahead of community awareness and discussion of this issue, the ADA notes a key point that is being wrongly downplayed in current public debate. Current and perhaps growing broader community criticism of Islamic community leaders is largely the result not of supposed Islamophobia, but of so much denial for so long by Islamic community leaders concerning the problematic minority of Islamists within their own community. As a telling example of the depth, longevity and continuing national consequences of such denial of an obvious problem, when participating in an SBS Insight program back in 2005, a then Vice President of the Australian Federation of Islamic Councils informed me, some 4 years after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, that he had personally never ever heard of the term Islamism. In the same Insight program, I was even criticised by some when politely pointing out that the positions advocated by the spokesman for Hizb ut-Tahrir participating in that program actually proved he was a religious bigot, not a mainstream Muslim. Before finishing, well, outside the specific terms of this inquiry, but of fundamental importance as a legal principle, the ADA wishes to briefly flag O&E's at COAG's decision last week regarding future state and territory legislation to facilitate the indefinite detention of convicted terrorists after they've served their sentence. The mooted comparison with similar laws already allowing the continued detention of some pedophiles and exceptionally violent criminals is surely not valid. Terrorism is chiefly a political and/or religious act. While many and perhaps most terrorists have psychological or other mental health problems, the expert recommendations from psychologists and psychiatrists needed to indefinitely detain some paedophiles and exceptionally violent criminals may not readily apply to assessing terrorist prisoners. Moreover, the indefinite detention of terrorists, particularly Islamist ones, will counterproductively highlight their claims of religious martyrdom generally. More specifically, given the significant problem with Islamist propaganda already within our prisons, such martyrdom is likely to hamper counter-radicalisation measures within these facilities. The ADA understands that such indefinite detention is partly the result of insufficient resources to monitor released prisoners, even when placed under a control order, because of the growing number of potential terrorists and their sympathisers requiring monitoring already. The question here is surely whether a resourcing problem should result in diminution of the principle that prisoners should be released when they've completed their prison sentences. In conclusion, thank you again for inviting the ADA to contribute to this inquiry into the Counter-Terrorism Amendment Bill No. 1 2005. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. James. Do we have any questions? No.
I'd only make the observation that I'd want to explore further your thoughts about the proposal for what you describe as indefinite detention. I don't know that it's indefinite, it's detention warranted perhaps after a sentence has been completed. But we'll obviously look at that if legislation is forthcoming. But I'd encourage, I mean, you put it in terms of the difficulty in terms of monitoring potentially the numbers of people involved in the community. I've also asked myself the question as to what might deter this sort of conduct through our legal system. We've been looking at the issue of citizenship deprivation as a potential deterrent. And I wonder if you were not pursuing a measure of this sort, particularly given the conduct in jails where people continue to radicalise others, which suggests that there is no reform. I wonder what other reform proposals you might be able to invite to our attention, because I mean, for me, it's a very worrying issue.
Well, obviously, in the case of prolonging detention after a prison sentence is finished, there'll have to be a lot more public debate about this. We're just flagging our unease at this stage that without a wider justification for the measure, it'll be hard to win community support for it, and indeed in the case of Islamist radicalism, if it's already a problem in our prisons, making martyrs of them is likely to make that problem worse, not necessarily better. The wider problem is that public debate on a number of these issues is so uninformed and emotive And it's very, very hard to crack down on Islamist terrorism and indeed help the Islamic community crack down on it when there's so much sloppy terminology and indeed sloppy thinking across the society.
I'd just make the point too that I am finding many more people in the Muslim community are becoming outspoken in relation to these issues, and I encourage that, but I think it is important to acknowledge that there is far more comment now than we may have seen.
Well, the tragedy is that the community and its leaders chose to do so little for so long, and you know it's the old scriptural injunction. You know, if you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And the amount of denial in the Islamic community over a long time has been a major contribution to the situation the community now finds itself in. Even this morning, in a previous submission, there seemed to be a disconnect where people in a Muslim organisation believed that the perception that counter-terrorism laws were aimed only against Muslims was a reasonable belief, when it is in fact a completely unreasonable belief, because the laws are aimed at anyone, and the idea that because only Muslim Australians have been prosecuted under these laws recently, that's largely because most of the terrorists, by definition, are Islamist terrorists, and they must come, however loosely, from some form of Muslim community.
Well, I mean, I do make the point from time to time that there are people of other religious persuasion who use terrorism. You know, it would be said that there is some Buddhist activity that leads to the very significant outflow of Rohingya Muslims from Burma. I mean, it's hard not to see some of the activities there as being terrorist. Some of the things that we've seen in Sri Lanka involve both Hindus and Buddhists engaging in behaviour that might well be described as terrorist.
That's undoubtedly right, but they're not actually doing that in Australia. And another great example is the IRA. The most successful intelligence agent in the history of the Irish state, as described by the head of the Irish police, was a bloke named Sean O'Callaghan, who actually broke with the IRA because he decided it had become an organisation completely motivated by religious bigotry and not politics. And it was a very successful radicalisation and counter-terrorism measure to run him in the IRA leadership for so long.
No, I just make the point that I think it's important to speak about these matters in context, that it does involve other groups in other parts of the world, and
there's an old truism in counterintelligence and counter-terrorism work that to be successful, the agencies have to be right all the time and get it right every time, and the terrorists have only got to get lucky once. And I think a lot of the public debate fails to actually acknowledge that, and this constant seeking of victimhood and martyrdom by people believing that they're somehow targeted by these measures when in actual fact they're not targeted by them is actually part of the problem. And we're very lucky in Australia that the percentage of Muslim Australians who have strong sympathies with Islamist terrorism is markedly lower than it is in many other countries. But largely that's an historical accident because of where we drew our Muslim immigrants from compared to, say, the United Kingdom.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr James. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence to which you may suggest corrections. You have been asked to provide any additional material. Please forward this to the Secretariat as soon as possible. If the committee has any further questions, the Secretariat will write to you. We'll now suspend proceedings for lunch, and it is the committee's request that we would resume again at 1:15, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you.